Even in the absolute chaos of a battlefield, there are supposed to be rules, codes of conduct, laws of war, a whole system designed to put some kind of order on incredible violence. But what happens when that order just breaks down? What happens when those lines get crossed? Today, we're going to dig into what happens when the warrior's code is broken. And look, this isn't some new feeling. This quote is from an American soldier over 100 years ago, and it captures this timeless sense of frustration and exhaustion. It's right there, in that state of mind, that the moral guardrails can start to fall apart. And that one word he uses, heathens, that's a huge clue that leads us straight to the core question we're exploring. So why does this happen? The reasons are super complex, right? They touch on psychology, on leadership, and even on national policy. There's no simple answer here, but if you look at a few key moments in history, a pattern really does start to show up. So before we can talk about how rules get broken, we have to understand what those rules even are. Let's start there. Okay, so a war of rules. It might sound strange, but modern warfare is anything but a lawless free-for-all. There is actually a pretty dense legal and ethical framework that every single US service member is supposed to operate inside of. Think of it like a pyramid of rules, layered on top of each other. At the very top, you've got the big one, the Geneva Conventions. That's international law. Step down from there, and you've got the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the UCMJ, which is the military's own internal legal system. Below that, you get mission-specific instructions, the Rules of Engagement, or ROE. And then, at the very bottom, you have the practical how-to guides and the field manuals. So with a system this layered, you've got to ask, how do things still go so horribly? Well, the first big piece of the puzzle here is psychological. It's this process where the enemy stops being seen as a person and becomes, well, something else, something less. This is the first and maybe the most critical step towards something truly awful happening. And this leads to this really powerful idea called distant enemies. When your opponent is really far away, either geographically or just culturally, it becomes way easier psychologically to see them as not quite human. Remember that soldier from the start calling his enemy heathens? That's exactly what this is. And once your enemy isn't fully human in your mind, the rules for how to treat them can start to feel, optional. And this isn't a one-off thing. Not at all. You see this disturbing pattern pop up again and again in American history. In the Philippines, soldiers used dehumanizing slurs. In the Pacific during World War II, taking enemy body parts as trophies was just shockingly common. And in Vietnam, there was this informal term, the mere Guk rule, which basically reflected a complete disregard for Vietnamese lives. The time, the place, the words, they all change, but the terrible process underneath is exactly the same. Okay, so that's the psychological side. Now let's shift gears and look at the second critical factor, leadership. The actual commands, and just as important, the climate that leaders create on the battlefield can either lock that discipline in place or completely shatter it. This quote, man, it's just chilling. Right before the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, Captain Medina allegedly told his troops that all the civilians were gone from the village, so anyone there would be considered enemies. It's so dangerously vague, right? It's the kind of thing that can easily be taken as a green light for killing indiscriminately. It creates an environment where atrocities become possible. And that brings us right into the courtroom, and maybe the most famous defense of all time. I was just following orders. We saw it in the trials for the Biscayne massacre in World War II, where a sergeant claimed he was just acting on what he thought his commander wanted. This gets to a really fundamental question. When does a soldier's duty to obey an order end and their responsibility to refuse an illegal one begin? But sometimes the evidence is so raw, so undeniable, that all the debates about orders and intent just stop. Yeah, this image from Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, it really says it all, doesn't it? When photos like this one came out in 2004, they sent shockwaves across the entire globe. This wasn't about vague orders in the heat of battle anymore. It was just undeniable proof of abuse and humiliation, and it forced a major reckoning with a massive failure of command. And that actually leads us to our third and maybe most complicated piece of this puzzle. Sometimes the blurring of lines doesn't start with a soldier on the battlefield. Sometimes it starts at the very highest levels of policy, with huge debates over what is and is not okay to do in the name of national security. So, after the 9/11 attacks, this huge, fierce debate just exploded inside the US government. What is torture? Like, what is the legal line? Let's look at the two very different ways people try to answer that. Okay, so On one side, you had a 2002 Department of Justice memo that made a legal case for a super narrow definition of torture. It said the term should only apply to acts that cause pain on the level of organ failure or death. The whole argument was about saving lives. But on the other side, you have this powerful moral argument from people like Senator John McCain, who was a former prisoner of war himself. He argued that when you use torture, you destroy the very values you're supposed to be fighting for. And this debate at the very top, that's not just talk. It sends a powerful signal all the way down the chain of command about what's considered permissible. So you've got dehumanization, leadership failures, and controversial policies. When all these things come together, what happens after the fact? Well, the history of military justice shows that getting real accountability is incredibly difficult. This table really gives you a snapshot of that struggle. At Pescari, a sergeant was found guilty, sentenced to life, but his sentence was just wiped away a year later. At Mile, dozens of soldiers were involved, but only one, Lieutenant Kelly, was convicted, and he was out on parole in 3.5 years. And at Abu Ghraib, the convictions were almost all focused on the low-ranking soldiers you see in the photos, with very little accountability making its way up the chain of command. So, what are we supposed to make of all this? The big takeaway is that while investigations do happen, and trials are held, the record is just all over the place. Real, consistent accountability, especially for the leaders who create the conditions for these things to happen, remains this huge, persistent challenge. You hear about the fog of war defense, how hard it is to prove criminal intent, and all the political pressure that surrounds these cases. And that leaves us with a really tough question. A question for all of us, really. When the rules of war get broken, the blame is never simple. Is it all on the individual soldier who did the act? Is it on the commanders who gave the orders or failed to keep things in check? Or does some of that responsibility lie with the society that trains them and equips them and sends them to fight in the first place? There's no easy answer here, but it's a question we absolutely have to keep asking.